All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Courtney Robertson, Director of Programs and Partnerships with the Collective Impact Forum. And on behalf of the Collective Impact Forum team and our host partners, FSG and the Aspen Institute Forum for Community Solutions, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual office hour, How to Navigate Backbone Challenges. And before we get started, we do want to send our love and hope that those of you who are joining us from Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina or other areas that are being impacted by the hurricane, that you are safe, and we appreciate you joining us despite that. And we are here in the No Soul Breaking Zone today. We played that song because despite the challenges that you may have to navigate or encounter as a backbone, your soul will not be broken. And I just love Beyonce. So appreciate that. So before we go any further in today's session, we want to begin our time together by acknowledging the indigenous lands that we are all joining from. Although we are meeting virtually, we believe that it is important to acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from indigenous territory, and we honor and respect the diverse indigenous peoples connected to this land and honor their present, their past, and future on these lands. We would like to acknowledge that this session is presented and recorded on the traditional land of the Muskogee, Ottawa, Chippewa, Potawatomi, Menominee, Ojibwe, Ohlone, Coast Salish, Muckleshoot, Snoqualmie, Suquamish, and Duwamish people past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people of these tribes. And we also love to invite you all in the chat to participate in this land acknowledgement. So if you are in the US or Canada, you may use the links that have been provided in the chat to identify which indigenous land you are calling in from today. And then if you are from outside of the US or Canada and you know which indigenous lands you're representing, we would love for you to put that into the chat. So we'll take a couple of seconds for folks to do that. I see the Abenaki. Thank you. We have someone calling in from England. Thank you for joining us today. Colombia. All right. Thank you all. And you can feel free to continue putting those into the chat. We appreciate you all participating as well. And for those of you where this might be new information for you, we invite you to make a note of what you've learned about the indigenous land that you are on. And this is a great first step to understand more about the indigenous communities that are a part of your area, both historically and currently. We also want to recognize that acknowledging indigenous lands and communities is just the first step in strengthening knowledge, relationships, and accountability to better support our indigenous community members. Relationship building and understanding community context are key factors for successful collaboratives. As you build your own deep knowledge of the many layers within the community or communities that your collective impact effort supports, taking action to learn, build connections, and strengthen relationships with your indigenous community members, including Native-led organizations and governance bodies, can be very helpful. So when thinking about your next steps, we'd like to offer a resource through the Native Governance Center, which is a Native-led nonprofit organization that supports leadership development and tribal governance support programs. They have wonderful resources to support acknowledging the land you all are on, and to take that beyond to that next step around acknowledgement and strengthening relationships within your own community. So we are including links to the Native Governance Center in the chat, and you can also find them at nativegov.org. All right. So really this month is kicking off a busy into the summer / beginning of fall for us. So thank you to those who were able to join us on August 17th for the Increasing Youth Engagement and Partnership Within Your Initiatives conversation. That recording is now available both on our website, and if you were signed up for that particular office hour, you should have received an email with the link to that recording as well. So we do encourage you all to take a look at that and the resources associated with it. And then today, again, we are here for How to Navigate Backbone Challenges. And then we have our Essentials for Collective Impact series, which kicks off on September 14th. So I do want to say an email went out today that next Friday, September 8th, is the last day to register for a full workshop series pass. And so with that pass, you get a discount, a small discount on all of those sessions, and you'd have access to all four workshops within that series. So I do want to encourage you all to both take a look at that for yourselves, but also share that with your networks if there are folks who may have interest. All right. And then some of our tips for today are tech tips. So one, we want to hear from you all. So we do encourage you to use the chat for just any conversation. If you want to share resources with each other, you can use the chat for that. And in regards to asking questions for our panel today, we do encourage you all to use the Q&A box. That's where I, as the moderator, will be looking for questions. So if you do have a question, we encourage you to put it in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And then again, you can use the chat box for any other general conversation or resource sharing. We will have a recording of today's session. It'll be made available later this week, and you will receive an email once that's available online. You have a downloadable PDF of the presentation, which will be available as well after today's session for your reference. And then your live captions are automatically on. So if you wish to turn them off, you will go to live transcript in your webinar menu, and then you'll choose hide subtitle. And then if you have any challenges today, technical difficulties, if you're looking for a resource, etc., you can feel free to reach out to Tracy Timmons-Gray on our team. And Tracy, thank you so much for your support with organizing today's virtual office hour. But you can reach out to her either by email, which is on the screen, or you can reach out to her directly in the chat box. Right. And so I am now going to well, quickly first, let me do this. Not going to be quiet just yet, but I do want to introduce your faculty/panel for today's conversation. So again, I will serve as moderator, but I'll also engage in the Q&A as well. So again, I'm Courtney W. Robertson with the Collective Impact Forum. And then we have today Jennifer Splansky-Juster, who's the Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum, and Paul Schmitz, who's the CEO of Leading Inside Out, and also serves as a Senior Advisor to the Collective Impact Forum team. So I won't belabor our time by reading their bios, but you can definitely check out their bios, my bio, and Tracy's bio on our website. All right, so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jen.
Thank you, Courtney, and hello, everybody. I'm pushing through a bit of laryngitis today, so thanks for understanding, but no pain, just sounding a little bit froggy over here. So we wanted to just do a tiny bit of framing before we dive into the Q&A, because today we'll be talking all about the role of the backbone, which I know many of you on the line are playing or are supporting. And so just as a reminder, of course, the backbone is what we call one of the 5 conditions of collective impact, and is often what makes collective impact work somewhat distinct from other forms of partnership, having dedicated staff to guiding the work of the collaborative forward. And the backbone role really supports activating the other 4 dimensions of collective impact. So as the backbone, you are really supporting the development of the common agenda and coordinating a lot of the systems change, policy, and programmatic work that's happening to move toward the common agenda. You're often doing a lot of the work gathering data, analyzing it, and bringing it to the collective so that people can make sense of the data together, and that folks can create spaces for learning together from that data. One of the most important roles of the backbone, of course, is connecting dots across the many different components of the work that is happening across partners in the collective, so that the different work stays connected to each other and that those activities are, as we would say, mutually reinforcing. And then, of course, there's a huge role that the backbone plays with respect to building the trust and relationships and creating spaces where the trust and relationships in a collective can be formed, so that you can have great, authentic, natural communication happening across partners, and also often creating those more formal spaces in meetings and formal communications to keep the work of the collective moving forward. So there are many nuances to the role of the backbone. We'll talk more about them, but sometimes it can be helpful to think about the role of the backbone in bringing to life the conditions of collective impact. And, the backbone role, as many of you know, is pretty distinct from other roles that folks may have played in past jobs, because the role is very facilitative. You are a broker of conversations. And so there are some qualities that have bubbled up as being really helpful in leading to successful backbone leadership and support. So being results based. And what this means is using data and giving data and providing data for the group to keep the collective focused on the common agenda and learning going forward. Keeping equity front and center, both in the outcomes that the group is seeking and in the process of how the collaborative is working together. Political savvy. So a lot about this work is systems change. So understanding what it takes to get to systems change and political change. And that can be policy change with a big P, public policy, as well as other institutional change that often comes from the collective impact work. Project management is certainly a role that often is played by that backbone team, keeping the trains moving on time. It is an underappreciated but very important role of the backbone. And then finally, last but not least, being an inclusive culture builder, creating those spaces where there are opportunities for trust to form. This is partly good meeting design, partly strong facilitation. Some folks might call this network weaving, but creating space to co-create a culture for the collective is an important quality for the backbone leader to hold. We often get asked, what kind of organization should play the backbone in my work? And there's truly no single answer to this question, as illustrated here. We have seen a really broad range of types of organizations play the backbone, and there are pros and cons to each of these. What I often say is what's most important is that the backbone team is really able to have the trust of partners, is seen as a neutral convener, and can live into those qualities that we just mentioned. And so the tax status, if you will, doesn't on its own matter, but living into the qualities of the backbone is what I would say is most important. And then last but not least, we often hear in conversations with folks in the field some misperceptions when it comes to the role of the backbone. And we wanted to just get out in front of some of those today and really recognize, it's not, the backbone's job is not to set the agenda for the group. As I've mentioned, the backbone is the convener, creating a process to co-create that agenda for the group. The backbone isn't dictating and driving the solutions. So they are not telling the collective what to work on, nor are they actually owning the implementation of all of the work of the collective. So they do not do all the work, while others are advising the backbone what to do. And we can get a little bit more into this in Q&A, I'm sure. Also, there's some situations where there's a perception that if I step into that backbone role, now I'm going to receive all the funding on this issue in my community. I think most backbones would attest that is furthest from the truth. It can be tricky to raise funds for the backbone, but there are some perceptions that you will be able to become a centralized funding intermediary, and that's not really the intention of the backbone. It's a little bit tricky, but we want to always be careful in how the collective is identifying who should be the backbone. Typically, it's not advantageous for the backbone to appoint itself, to raise their hand and say, follow me into this initiative, because you want that backbone to be collectively named or appointed and endorsed by a critical mass of folks in the community. So yes, someone has to convene the first meetings and facilitate those first meetings, but it's always helpful in those scenarios to take a step back once there's a bit of momentum and ask who ought to be playing the backbone in this scenario. And let's just recognize that the backbone, it's not business as usual. This is not program implementation. This is complex work. The skills and the way staff spend their time is often going to be very different than program implementation. Time is going to be spent network weaving, following up with folks. Part of it is the administration of keeping the trains running on time, but it's also being in the community, championing the work, and really thinking about that systems change work rather than a more traditional program manager role. So these may or may not have been perceptions that you held, but we do often hear these in the field. So wanted to just speak to those right up front. So with that, I'm going to actually turn it to Courtney, who is going to guide us through some of the questions we received prior to today leading into this webinar.
Yes, thanks so much, Jen. And as Jen mentioned, one, thank you all for submitting your questions in advance. I think we received somewhere close to 100. I hope I'm not making it up. I think it was like near that ballpark. And so what we did was there were some themes across a few of those questions. And so we've sort of grouped those, if you will, into themes. And so we'll start with those questions. I do see that we already have questions coming into the chat. And so again, the Q&A box. So again, encourage you all to put your questions there. So Paul and Jen, the first question that we have is around neutrality, and essentially asking, is a backbone neutral? And how can you keep your voice at the table while also facilitating and supporting the work as a backbone?
So I'll take a stab at starting that. I think there's two parts of that. First, being neutral in the facilitator role is still being neutral in service to the group's agreed upon agenda. And so when the groups created a set of strategies, agreements, etc., one should not be neutral in enforcing or encouraging or keeping people on the path of what people have already agreed to. So sometimes I feel that folks feel like holding people accountable for their commitments or encouraging people to shift away from something they want to do towards what they've already agreed to do is not being neutral when you're actually just holding the group's agreement. The second thing I would say is that there are times when, as facilitator, you might see that there's information or a point of view or an option that people haven't thought of that, if introduced, could help the group. And it's times like that when you may say, it's easy for me because I wear a hat. I'm going to take off my facilitator hat for a moment and contribute, and then say it, and then say, I wanted to put that because I thought it'd be helpful, and then put back on your hat. I think the more intentional and transparent you can be about when you're breaking role, the better it is. When you're shifting between participant and facilitator, that can make people feel like you're manipulating. It can confuse people. It can give people a sense that you're not fair. When you're intentional and transparent about breaking role, then people will accept that neutrality better. And one thing you can do is I was given me once, you can have a hat that says neutral, and then you can take it off when you're not being neutral. But that's more advanced facilitation.
I love that. I have to get a neutral hat. Jen, anything you'd like to add to that response? All right.
So many good questions coming in. I want to make sure we get to many.
Absolutely. And I'll just put in a plug that, again, in that series, there is a workshop focused on facilitating collaborative spaces, where we'll talk a bit about neutrality in that role. So encourage you all to take a look at that. Thank you, Paul. All right, so the next question is around relationships and clear goals. So as the backbone, what are some ways to improve work relationships and establish clear goals and roles with alliance partners?
Paul, go for it. My voice is taking a break for a moment.
Okay. Second, I'm trying to navigate here. Can you repeat the question? I just want to make sure.
Absolutely. Yes. So essentially, like, as the backbone, what are ways to improve like your relationships with alliance partners and also establish clear goals and role clarity with those partners?
So there's two things. One is, with your partners, you should have, again, a clear agenda. What is the results? What are your strategies? What are your metrics? What's the work plan to achieve those? And the clearer you are on that, the clearer it is to like do the rest. And so the first thing is make sure you all have clarity about what you're trying to achieve, what the strategies are, who has to do what, how it'll be measured, all of that. The clearer you make all of that, the easier it is to hold the rest. The second is to have clear role descriptions. You know, the steering committee, the partners, the action teams, there should be role, descriptions for each of those that define how are decisions made, who can join the group, or how are people brought into the group, what are the responsibilities if you join. Have that as clear as possible. And then finally, relationally, the way to do relational work is be relational. You need to not just use the meeting as the only point of contact with people. If you notice someone's reserved, talk to them afterward, call them afterward, pick up the phone. I just worked with a group last week, and they were all concerned about another project that they thought they might be getting a turf on, and they were going to email them, and they just picked up the phone and called and had the greatest conversation, set up a meeting the next week. We forget sometimes that the best way to connect is not always email, especially email to lots of people that they're just one of. Direct outreach, pick up the phone, get together with people, spend time with them, just do a check-in on Zoom for 30 minutes, whatever, or go to their office. Find ways to be relational, because it will make your work a lot easier if people know you and sense you as a person and not just someone emailing them lots of stuff.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that, when I was working in a backbone, one of the practices that we had was before you officially joined the partnership, it was essentially like an onboarding, right? But there were a series of conversations, one to understand the partner's work and to make sure that it was aligned to what was happening across the partnership space, but also for them to understand sort of how we were positioning ourselves as the backbone, what they could expect from us, what the expectations of what were from them in terms of engagement, in terms of, meeting participation, et cetera, so that those things were very clear. And those conversations were held both with the executive director or president of those organizations, but also with folks who would actually be engaging in those work group spaces. So those were the conversations we held. And the leaders of those work group spaces were having the same conversations with new partners as well. So I definitely encourage you. It's much more of a lift, but it saves you so much more on the background. And it's also a conversation that you can refer back to, right? Like we had this conversation around this, you all have now missed X number of meetings, et cetera, so you have something to go back on versus you just jumped into the partnership and there was no conversation around expectations and role clarity. All right. So the next question is around ownership and participation. So how do you get members of the collaborative who are not the backbone to share ownership and participation in the goals?
So it starts with they should have been part of creating the goals. That, we call it a common agenda because the agenda, which is the goals or results you're seeking, the strategies, the indicator you're trying to move, or the population systems change you're trying to move, the metrics and performance measures you'll measure, that should be created with the group. Now, obviously not everyone is involved in that. You recruit people after that, but they should join because they've agreed that whatever that goal and strategy is something that's critical for the community and that they want to participate in. Again, they should have a clear role responsibility document that outlines, if you join, this is what you're responsible for. And ideally, if they're a member of an action team or work group of some form, that group should have a work plan that says, if our goal is to move 300 more kids to grade level reading, these are the 5 things we're going to coordinate in this work group across these organizations, and we need these organizations to do these bits of work if we're going to get there. The work plan should define the work of the partners, not the work of the backbone. The backbone's job is to create a plan on how they're going to coordinate the work of the partners to do the work in the common agenda that moves the result or system change we're trying to move. And so the more that's clear and out, the more share ownership, build ownership. But too often collective impact efforts look more like committees advising the backbone on a project that feels like they all made a decision and they only have to do light lifts and the backbone will do the work. That's not what it's meant to be. It's meant to be a collection of people whose job it is to move work that advances whatever that system change or result is we're trying to move together.
Thanks, Paul. And the only thing I would underscore, excuse me, there is alignment. Like, does their work actually align to the goals and work that's happening in the space? Because sometimes that's where you see the rub. Like, I know we had organizations who just wanted to be a part of the work, right? And so they would show up for every work group meeting, and it's like, but you don't even do work in post-secondary. Why are you in this space, right? And so just making sure that people are clearly aligned, which goes back to having those upfront conversations about folks about where they're going to engage and what that looks like.
And it's great they come to the meetings, but we can also be clear that our job is not to make work for them. Yep. Our job is to do the work plan and move the common agenda we've agreed to, not to try and accommodate partners by building more and more work so that they feel included. The goal is to create an agenda we're going to advance, and the people we need to advance that work should be in the work group.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. All right, so our last pre-question, and then we'll jump to all of your questions, as many questions as we can get to in the Q&A box. So the next one is around funding. And just in general, I guess, what are some ways that folks can be thinking about funding or securing funding for the work of the backbone?
This is always a difficult question to answer because, one, the issue you're working on, the community you're in, the all of that, the funding environment in a large urban setting focused on education is very different than the funding environment for environmental protection in a small town in a rural area, is very different than a public health fundraising effort in a mid-sized city. Like, it's just the funding environments are so different based on the number of funders, issues that funders are focused on, et cetera. So we just have to recognize it's always hard to answer that. With that said, I think a couple just tips we found really helpful. One is, too often I see people trying to raise money around descriptions of the collective. We should be raising money around the impact. The goal of doing collective impact is not the collective. The goal of collective impact is the impact. So we're not raising money to build a group that's going to do a process. We're raising money to move third grade reading scores, or to increase the high school graduation rate, or to move healthy birth outcomes up. We're raising money around the outcome, the result, not around the process. And I think a lot of times people go to funders and are like, we want to do this process. The process should be in service to the result. Funders are much more interested in funding a result than they are a process, but they're happy to fund a process when they can see how it will move the result. And so that would be my biggest piece of advice. The other thing is to, look at who's to do the normal donor research of who funds on that issue in your region, find out who some of your partners are funded by, like, do some of that research and see if they're, and see if some of the partners can help with that, or if you can bring funders to your table. Jennifer or Courtney, anything you'd add?
Just the one other thing I would add, I'm going to try talking again, is sometimes having your partners make the case with and for you can be helpful. It demonstrates the value they see in your work, and they also are vouching for the role that you play. And so if you have good partners who are really appreciating the role that you're playing, ask them if they can be partners with you in fundraising for that role.
Absolutely. And I would say that funders like for their money to work smart and not hard. So if there is, to Paul's point, like you're talking about the issue, and there are multiple organizations, right, who are coming together to work around this issue, is, I think, a lot more appealing than 10 different organizations coming to a funder wanting to do the same type of work, right? So just thinking about how you can really leverage the partnership to draw momentum. All right. So now we're going to go to a question in the chat. So it's prefaced by, you just raised, and this is going back, Jen, to you sharing about the backbone role. You just raised the distinction about a backbone not being designed to be a funding intermediary. What if the community desires that of you, in large part due to their trust in the organization as well as the need? Are there examples where a backbone has taken on the role of a funding intermediary? And if so, what's worked and what hasn't worked?
Sure, I'm happy to start on that one, and thank you for the question, Evan. Nice to see you. I think that context is everything. So of course my observations are overgeneralizations. In the case where you are an established backbone and feel as though through your conversations and feedback, you have great trust of your partners and they are asking that of you. Perhaps you have a bigger staff or more administrative capacity to do that. Listen to your partners. I think, that's really important. I think it's helpful if you do that, to always have checkpoints to ensure that folks feel comfortable in how that's moving forward. And that is the backbone. Different partners aren't getting privileged in ways that don't feel right to the vision of the collective. But I think there are ways, of course, to do that responsibly if that's being asked of you. I've also seen backbones create like grant making advisory committees. I don't know if I'd go so far as to call it a participatory grant making committee, but having those decisions not just sit with the same person that leads the backbone team, but have those decisions be made by, the funds can flow through the backbone, but have those decisions being made by not just a single person who also is holding kind of the strategy and vision. So those are a couple tips. That's a great question. Paul, you look like you want to jump in.
I was just say it can be a thankless job. And I think that the main thing is clarity and transparency. Everything you do rests on trust, and nothing breeds distrust, conflict, or issues more than money. And so the extent that you're doing it, you just have to have incredible clarity and transparency about how resources raised, how decisions will be made, how it'll be distributed. You can't have anyone think there's any backroom conversations or influence on money, or your whole trust falls apart. So it works. It just works with clarity and transparency and all the things Jennifer said.
Ditto. And I've seen it where, there was an established backbone who started taking on some of that responsibility through a large grant. And there were just so many other challenges that came along with that I don't think they anticipated around it, because funding shifts power dynamics in a lot of ways. So you also have to account for what that means for your work, and how could that shift that, and how can you all mitigate it as much as possible if that's a route you're deciding to take. All right, so we're going to shift a little bit to talk about boards. We do have a couple questions around boards. So one is, can you speak to the role of the board of directors of a standalone backbone organization, especially in the context of when there is a separate leadership table establishing representing community partners, and community members most impacted by inequities? And then sort of a follow-up to that is like, what are some successful practices to help boards buy into the value and impact of a backbone as a neutral convener?
So I'm a little confused by this to start just from the standpoint of like the board, right? So if we're saying the board of directors of an organization that's taking on a backbone role for collective impact, and then they talked about having a leadership table separate, we assume most collective impacts have a steering committee of some form that is the governance table for the collective impact effort. The organization playing that backbone role, if we're saying, because I've seen situations where the board of directors of the backbone is effectively the steering committee for collective impact, because that's all the organization does. There are also organizations that do a lot of things, of which one is backboning, and which they have a governance group for that, but they have the board of directors that still oversees that organization where that backbone is sitting. And if the question is how to get them on board, I think it's, again, as with funders generally, it's the reason why we're doing this is the impact. And here, being able to show them what the purpose, plan, etc. is, and why we've been chosen this role, and how this role will help us achieve our mission and move our mission forward by supporting other organizations to move this issue, because it's bigger than any one organization. So if it's a question of getting the board on deck with the role we're going to play in the community, that's kind of how I'd approach it. If the question is the distinction, if our organization, all we are is a backbone, and we have a board and we have a separate leadership team, that can get more tricky. And I think that I've seen examples where the board is more like an executive committee that more deals with like the hiring of the executive director, the financing, the audit, like kind of the more operational tasks. And the steering committee is not the fiduciary for the organization, but is guiding the work, and that the leadership of that steering committee sits on that small executive committee or board. Again, it just depends what model you're talking about, because that could be interpreted a bunch of different ways.
Yeah, Paul, I was thinking along the same lines. The only thing I would add is that, typically a steering committee is 15 to 25 folks. That's probably a lot bigger than your nonprofit board, maybe in some cases, but a lot of your nonprofit boards are going to be much smaller and not have the same representation that you would have on the steering committee. So I think it's really important that the collective vision and common agenda come from that broader steering committee. And then to the different sort of scenarios Paul outlined, I do often see that not smaller nonprofit board with more of those financial and governance responsibilities for the folks that are employed by the backbone, but not the broader community work.
Thank you both. I have nothing to add to that. Both great responses. So this is a very interesting question. What if you have two backbones in one community under the same charge?
That's a problem. I mean, if they're trying to pursue the same goals on the same issue, then they're going to drive the organizations who work on that crazy, because they're going to be invited to multiple meetings. We've seen examples where there's a group trying to do the work, and then someone comes in and sees it as like, doesn't either know it exists or doesn't think it's effective enough, so they create a second one and feel like they can do it better. And that just creates issues. Like, the two need to get together and work it out, to not drive the funders, the community, the partners, to make it more difficult for them. I think that, I don't know. I mean, I've worked in communities with a lot of different collective impacts, usually not working in the same place. I know one specific example right now where a group is doing it, but it's taking time, and some more entrepreneurial leader decided they're going to create something and wants to run with it, and is kind of running over the existing effort. And that's a problem we're trying to resolve. But that happens. But if there's two, they need to work it out.
Sounds like a duel, Paul. A duel?
No, it sounds like a difficult conversation with
absolutely,
with someone wearing a neutral hat involved. Yeah.
All right. So speaking of conflict, how do you create a space for resolving conflicts and engaging participating organizations with differing values and interests?
That depends on a bunch of things, like what is the conflict over? Is it different interests? Is it resources? Is it deeper value differences? Is it we have partners who are opposed to our focus on racial equity? Like, I mean, it can be a bunch of different things. And so I think that to start, the group has to have a set of agreements, and that everyone who's in the space has to abide by those agreements. And that should include some set of core values, and so that those discussions have a frame to operate in, instead of just being how people interpret things. I think in the case where you've got those differences, it's a matter of there's a bunch of different conflict resolution ways of addressing it. I mean, obviously the backbone role is partly to bring people together and try to have the conversation, or to work with maybe people who have greater trust among them or greater credibility with those people to help guide a conversation. Like, there's a lot of different variables in terms of how one would approach that based on, but the main thing you can't do is just wish it away. Like, you've got to engage it. And the question is, am I the right person to facilitate this conversation? Do I have the skill, and do I have the neutrality and the trust of the two parties? And if not, who does have that trust and neutrality I might be able to bring in to join me to support that conversation? If it's a matter of disagreement about core beliefs or values of the effort, that's something that's different. And you have to kind of go back to, what have we agreed to? And if one of the groups is not willing to abide by what we've agreed to, then they're probably not aligned, as you said earlier, Courtney, and probably not part of it. And so I don't know. There's another one where there's just a lot of variables involved that would determine different approaches.
Thanks, Paul. Jen, anything like to add to that?
Trying to hit some questions in the Q&A, typing answers as well to get through more of them.
No, thank you for that. All right, this one has a lot of votes, so I'm going to go to this next question. Here we go. The point on the backbone does not do all the work is definitely a challenge when partners have less capacity than the backbone. Do you have tips on how to encourage engagement or partners to do their fair share?
So I will go back to one of my principal beliefs about collective impact is clear strategies guide clear commitment. When the strategies, the metrics, the work plans aren't clear, that creates room for everyone to do what they think they can do. The clearer that work is, the more that when people join the table, they know exactly what their role is to do. And I find in my work with groups that a lot of groups struggle with that. There's a lack of clarity at the core of their work in terms of really specific goals, strategies, metrics that they're trying to move together. With that said, if I have that clarity and people aren't pulling their share and aren't achieving the things in the work plan, we have to go back to whether people continue to feel a sense of urgency about the problem itself we're trying to solve. And we've got to call the question, like, do we feel like this is no longer an urgent problem in our community? Because people clearly aren't doing the work. And therefore that gives, the question is there something else wrong? Or is it we no longer feel this is an urgent problem and we have the right strategies in place to address it? And I think sometimes that conversation has to happen. And we've got to be willing to call the question. But I find it's either I find most often it's lack of clarity around the strategy, or it's like we're doing a set of activities and no one really believes they're going to achieve the result, or the strategies are insufficient or vague. I find it's often the problem sits at the center of the work and whether the work is really clear and people are truly committed and feel a sense of urgency around it.
Yeah,
and recognizing that, and just quickly, and recognizing that people also are carrying a lot on their plates. And so sometimes it's like people, but then the more we can make that a transparent conversation. And if we have a work plan and we're holding people accountable, we're beginning each meeting, going through what people were supposed to do between meetings, like make accountability a formal process. Don't make it something that's kind of differentially enforced. Make it real. Every meeting we should be going through, this is what we said we do last time. What have we gotten done? What do we need to get done? And people should be free to say, like, I'm not going to be able to get anything done in the next month because my organization has a huge event. It's thing going, cool, you've named that, we can work around that. At least we know that. But like, again, the more transparency, clarity, and the more we work from plans, the easier that work is. Sorry,
yeah. No, you're fine. I 100% agree. And the only other thing I would add is like taking a step back as the backbone team or support team to ask, why are we doing all the work? Like we can easily name it on the obvious things, right? Like, or blame it on the obvious things like, well, they don't have a lot of capacity as a partner, right? But sometimes is we may not believe that they'll do the work, right? Or we want the work done in a certain way, or you may actually have your own agenda that you're trying to, achieve. So like really being honest about why that's happening and then doing the work to undo that. I know for me, I actually joined the backbone team where I'd been a partner within the work for 3 years. So it took a while for me to shift my thinking and my approach to the work because I was so used to being a partner and like contributing to strategy and contributing to the work. And so I would find myself a lot of times in those meeting spaces doing what Paul said we shouldn't be doing, right? Like I wasn't being clear about being the facilitator or participant. I quite frankly came across as a participant because that's what I was used to doing. And once I was aware of that, I had to start doing the work to be more intentional about not doing that. So also just being self-reflective in a sense about why that's happening and what you can do for it to not happen. All right. Let's see, there's so many great questions here. So I'm like, where do we go? What are some, go for it. Paul?
I was saying people can vote on the questions, and when you vote them up, it like lets us know which ones number of people have. So you can like the questions in the question and answer box if you want it. Push it up on our list.
Thank you for that. So we have a couple. One is around metrics. So what are some metrics that we've seen used that communicate the value add of the backbone organization?
So I'll chime in here. I think you're going to get, certainly as the backbone, hopefully you're tracking big picture progress on the results that you're trying to move. And then I think a lot of it comes from asking your partners for feedback on the role that you as the backbone have played in contributing to that progress. So using surveys of your steering committee or your work groups, asking for how are you living into that backbone role? To what extent are you effectively guiding the vision and strategy? Are you creating those spaces for building trust and relationships? So you can think about what the role you're trying to play is and ask your partners. And then you have some data to share saying this is how we're contributing. I think another way you could also think about it is seeing, for example, if one of the roles is guiding vision or strategy, you could see how many of the partners can accurately describe the common agenda. How many of the partners are advocating for the work using the tools that you have given them? How many people are holding equity in the forefront in the conversations? And again, this is data you as the backbone can collect, or if you have resources to get an evaluation partner to help you collect some of that data, that can be useful. But I think it's being clear about what your role is and then trying to get partner and community feedback on how you're living into that role. What would others want to add to that?
I have nothing to add. That's exactly what I would do.
Yep. Yeah, I agree with that 1,000%. And I think as often as you can collect some of that information, do it, right? So also thinking about what's happening in those work groups, right? So after every work group meeting, we actually had a survey, like, how was this meeting? Do you feel like you reached the goals? Like, how was the facilitation, right? So we're understanding how we're contributing to helping move their work forward and things that we might be able to improve upon in real time. So thinking about it from what can we get on a regular basis, right? And then what are those things we might need to be looking at less frequently as well. And those are some of the things Jen highlighted. Okay. Our next question, any suggestions on how to encourage collaboration between partners that currently do not trust each other? And that's a tough one.
That goes back to the conflict question we talked about before. Like, it's one is not everyone has to work with everyone. That's the first thing. Like, I think figuring out where the work is and where people have to work together, and then like understanding where is the difference between the organizations. Is it some path, like I would want to know more about why they have those issues, and then determine what's the way to get them to work together. I have been worked with collective impact efforts where we've actually asked people to stop participating, where we've fired people from collective impacts because their participation, role, lack of trust, or issues were actually a block on progress for the group. I've been with groups where we've had groups that we had to figure out how to get them to work together, and there was some intentional relationship building, brokering. It's not a one-time, but a series of work to get them to kind of play nice together. Sometimes we've utilized funders or others to kind of like make people sit in the room and play nice and make it clear that there'll be consequences if they don't. Like, I think, again, it's often there's a lot of things that might mitigate how you do it, but it's and it depends what the source and kind of conflict is. If it's just turfiness over credit and resources, that's easier to solve. If there's some actual, real conflict between the two organizations, it'll take a process. If it's more turfiness, that's something that's easier to solve and might just take having somebody like sit them down and talk to them like adults.
Jen, anything to add there? So, Paul, thank you for that response, but because you mentioned this, we did have a question in the Q&A box about essentially how would you go about terminating or divorcing, using their words, a partner who violates an MOU, and what's the best way to communicate that to other partners in the collaborative?
So again, the more transparent our work plan and commitments and accountability is, the easier it is for everyone to see who's getting things done and who's not getting things done. When people are violating core aspects of what we've agreed to, they need to have a conversation and be reminded this is like a collective effort. This is what we've all agreed to. You have to have that direct conversation with them. Here's how you're violating. If that group or organization or individual is not willing to do it, you have to be willing to say, like, we're going to ask you not to participate anymore. And I know a collective that went so far as they had to change their name and change their structure as a way to get somebody out, and who was just blocking progress on a constant basis. In other cases, it's been more a real conversation. And again, as a backbone leader, you have a steering committee. This isn't a decision you should be making individually. It should be something that, your steering committee, like, to me, that comes up as like, we have an organization that's violating all aspects of this, and we're going to ask them to go. And like, maybe it's the chair of the steering committee who needs to have the conversation if they've got more influence or pull. But figuring out who should have that conversation, of course, I would always go to someone first and have the conversation about them not fulfilling things and try to work through that. But in the event that they were not able to work through it or unwilling to work through it, then I've got to figure out, how do I do that? And again, you don't want that decision to sit with you alone. That should be something that goes up to the steering committee or goes up to the co-chairs of that work group or whatever. It should be a joint decision that's made by not one person. And then it should be a collective effort of that leadership, the steering committee, the work group, or whoever to work with you to have the conversation with that person that we prefer that we ask them to leave the group and that they will no longer be a group. Again, if your role and responsibility has, like, this is how people join and these are what's required, and they're violating that MOU, then you're again saying this is something you've agreed to do. You're refusing to do something you've agreed to do. This is a group for people. There's a coalition of people who've agreed to do these things. You're no longer in agreement with it. You can't be part of it. You have to agree to this to be part. To be this table, you have to meet the responsibilities and agreements we've made. It's hard. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's hard, and you'll lose sleep over it and everything else. But that's the way I'd approach it.
Yeah, and it's super hard because I've had to have these types of conversations, both with, the organizations even leading some of those work spaces, right? Not fulfilling their responsibilities and being the leaders of those spaces. But to put a little more structure to what Paul has offered, how sort of what our escalation plan, if you will, was I, as the facilitator and supporter of that space on the backbone team, had regular communication and contact with the convener of those, or leader of those work group spaces, right? They would sort of be that first line of point of contact for us, right? So, hey, Paul is like inconsistently showing up, or Paul is showing up and like he's never on, aligned with the rest of the group and always a detractor, whatever. And the leader of that group space, right, would actually have the first level of conversation or conversations. And if it needed to, we would then elevate it, to our executive director, who could then have a conversation with their ED or whoever's leading, that particular organization to figure out what's happening, right? So several steps before you get to the point of like, you just don't need to be here. But I am a fan of get right or get left is sort of my mantra, right? So if there are folks blocking the work, you definitely want to make sure you're having those tough conversations. All right, and we have a few minutes left, but this question does have a lot of upvotes. So how do you address the challenge when partners do not have clear or common understanding of what collective impact model means?
I think that you've got to continue to orient people. And I think one of the things we often do is we think if we orient people once, they've got it. I was just in a city yesterday for the second time. I was there in late July and then again 4 weeks later. and we did the same 6-slide open to reorient people. And some of the people who were there the first time said it finally clicked the second time. And sometimes we make the mistake of thinking we like describe the process at the first meeting for like 10 minutes. And everyone now understands it after we've read 50 articles and participated in these calls and everything else. We have to continue to orient people and not try to orient them in the whole thing, but maybe in bits and pieces, and walk people through the journey and meet them. And I think I'm just saying this, my intro to collective impact, Jennifer, as like any of us have like these intro to collective impact slides we would use, but I think orienting people to what our process and our goal and our agreements are. And I always start meetings, even for groups that have been around for a long time, with starting with like, what's our goal? What are our core strategies? What are our agreements? And now we'll meet, like, just so we're always keeping in front of people, this is why we exist and what we're here to do and what we've agreed to do. And you let that stuff leave the meetings, you end up losing that sense of what you're here for. And then as people join, you've got to orient people to your process and your work to date, not just have them show up at a meeting and jump in. You've got to spend time with people orienting them.
Anything, Jen?
I appreciate Paul's answer. I would also just add that a lot of it will be people experiencing the work, and that it feels different, hopefully, than, or possibly, than other meetings they've been a part of. And a responsibility of the backbone is to make it feel different, right? And to live into putting collective impact into practice. Because if you're saying you're doing it, but you're living it in a different way, that's not going to help people. Well, it's not going to be effective, but also people are going to be confused and not understand what it is that you're doing if you're calling it collective impacts. If the backbone is still making all the decisions and reporting out at meetings, and that's how meetings are being spent, then that's, if you're saying you're doing it, following through with how you do the work is just as important as giving the theory.
1,000% agree. I think if you tell people like, and we're going to be doing collective impact, most people are going to look at you like, what is that? So I think just you modeling, to Jen's point, right? Like you structuring and modeling the work in the way in which it needs to happen says a lot more than trying to explain to people, right? Sometimes what's happening. And what I'll say that the backbone that I work for, when they first started, like were appointed by it was this they were actually appointed like by the school board, essentially, not the school board, but a joint committee. There was a huge merger happening across 2 big school districts in the city and county. And so as a part of that, my organization was birthed. But they spent months just educating people on like what's going to be different about this approach, right? And then to Paul's point, it wasn't just happening like in these large community spaces, it was also happening in those smaller work group spaces once they were launched, right? To name like, this is what the clear difference is in what we're asking you to do. And also recognizing that when people meet and gather, like how people have traditionally engaged in meetings is very different from what collective impact calls for, right? Like we're used to showing up to meetings, getting information, and then we can go, right? And you may or may not do something with that. Collective impact actually calls for action, right? Like there's follow-up after this meeting. People are committing to next steps and actions. They're coming back, right? It's helping move the work forward. And so also recognizing that it's just a very different way of asking people to show up and work. And so the consistency is the biggest piece, right? Like consistently asking people, what's your commitment? What are your next steps? Consistently asking people to check in around those, right? Consistently looking at data, et cetera. So as long as you have those practices in place, people know that when they show up to whatever collaborative meeting, right, they know what to expect. Like, I know they're going to ask me about my action commitment, so let me make sure that I, have a response, et cetera. So definitely being consistent. And unfortunately, we are at the end of our time. I know there were a lot more questions in the Q&A box that we didn't get a chance to get to, but we appreciate all of the questions, all of the wonderful engagement today. And just before you leave, I want to remind you all of our upcoming Essentials for Collective Impact Fall Workshop series. Again, if you'd like to get a full series pass, you can register for that by next Friday, September 8th, and also registration for the very first session on tools for collaborative engagement and planning. The registration closed for that next Friday, September 8th as well. But again, thank you all so much for your engagement today. We hope that this was a value add to your day. We look forward to seeing you at the next event, but have a great day.